When modern people speak of the end of marriage, normally what we are talking about is a divorce settlement and attorney fees and custody. But in philosophy, that's not what we mean by the end of marriage. The end is the final purpose of a thing, the goal towards which it's directed. And when we look at the purposefulness of things, we are speaking of teleology, from the Greek word telos, that is, examining things in light of their ultimate purpose. Now, marriage, both as a sacrament of the Church and a natural institution, has its own ends, its own purpose that is proper to it. Now, church tradition, going all the way back to St. Augustine, but really defined in 1930 by Pope Pius XI, says that marriage has three ends: procreation, the mutual good of the spouses, and the sacramental grace proper to it. So marriage, because it's both natural and supernatural, has natural and supernatural ends. The first two ends are natural, procreation and the mutual good of the spouses. And the third end is supernatural, the sacramental grace. Now, because it's the first two ends that are contested these days, we're going to focus in this video on talking about the natural ends of marriage and the relation between the two. So what is the relationship between the two natural ends of marriage, between procreation and the mutual good of the spouses? Now, both ends are integral to marriage, that is, they must be sought in unity with each other. To seek mere procreation apart from marital union is immoral, and this, by the way, explains the Church's opposition to things like cloning, in vitro fertilization, and so on, practices that seek to obtain mere procreation without any marital union. But also to seek the mere good or pleasure of the spouses apart from procreation is also immoral. And this isn't just a Catholic thing. All Christians for almost 2,000 years were in unanimous agreement on this point. In fact, the real turning point didn't come until 1930, when the Anglican Church held the Lambeth Conference, where they stated that the good of the spouses is the primary end of marriage, and that children are just a side effect of marriage, not the primary end. Now, what this did essentially was sundered the unity of the ends, broke them up, and later other Christian denominations would follow. And so you had, going into the 20th century, the sexual revolution. So what's the relation of these ends to each other then? The Church's answer is that one of these ends is objective and the other is subjective. Now, we need to define what we're talking about here. Objective means what is intended by nature. Subjective means what is willed by the person. For example, let's say you're eating dinner with friends. By the nature of the act itself, the end or the purpose of eating is to take nourishment into your body to sustain yourself. That is the objective end of eating, of every act of eating. But you have another end when you spend time with friends eating dinner, enjoying social time, enjoying your friend's company. That's the subjective end. That's what you will. So just like eating dinner with friends, marriage has an objective element, that is what is intended by nature, and a subjective element, that is what is intended or willed by the person. So we have two distinct ends, one proper to the act itself, one willed by the person, but both fulfilled in a single act. So in marriage, we have procreation. Procreation is the objective end of marriage. That is, this is the end that's intrinsic to the act of intercourse. Marriage is biologically ordered towards procreation, regardless of the will of the person. It's ironic that sometimes when people are fornicating or having sex outside of marriage and one of them unintentionally gets pregnant, they will say that something went wrong. Well, actually, from a biological standpoint, something went right with that act, not something went wrong. And this is because procreation is intrinsic to the very act of intercourse. That is the objective end of sexual intercourse and of marriage. The good of the spouses is the subjective end. That is what's willed by the spouses themselves. And this could be friendship, mutual aid, the pleasure and happiness derived from being in the marital union. These are all good things, and we don't mean to minimize them, but they are subjective. That is what is willed by the spouses in entering into marriage. The objective end is the primary end. Procreation is the primary end of marriage, and this is by nature. It's not within the authority of man to transgress. Man can cooperate with God by also willing to pursue the natural ends of marriage, and this is why the Church always teaches that marriages have to be open to life, but man is not free to transgress God's ends for marriage. In other words, man is a cooperator with God, but he does not have full autonomy. We do have a nature, we have a human nature, and we are bound by the teleology, the purposefulness inscribed in our nature. What is the role of the subjective end of marriage? The two ends may coincide or they might not. They might be divergent, but not contradictory. For example, like when a couple marries in ignorance of the Church's teaching and God's will for marriage. Now that's not ideal, but it's still a marriage. The problem really is when the subjective end, that is what we will, is in direct contradiction to or obstructs the natural end of marriage. When the two ends are contradictory to one another, that is when we are subjectively willing or trying to do something that directly contradicts or obstructs the objective end of marriage, no marriage can take place. Because the natural end of marriage is frustrated and it's simply impossible, just like no eating can take place if nourishment is intentionally prevented from getting into the body. It's impossible to intentionally prevent nourishment from getting into the body while simultaneously claiming that you're eating, right? So to enter into marriage, spouses must, at a minimum, at least implicitly will the ends natural to the institution. They express this will, they express this intention by the act of sexual intercourse. Now this explains a lot. This explains, for example, why the Catholic Church teaches that contraception, even used within marriage, is always wrong, because it directly frustrates the ends proper to the sexual act. But this also explains why no homosexual relationship can constitute a marriage. No homosexual relationship is capable of sexual intercourse, of being procreative. It's impossible. This is very important to understand that in the Christian tradition, procreation is not merely biological reproduction. Procreation is actually an act of cooperation with God, and it takes into account not only the physical creation of a new person, but their nourishment, their education, and their formation. So the Church doesn't take a strict biologistic approach, and this also explains why actual conception of a child is not necessary for any given marriage to be ordered to procreation. And this is the point where people get confused, because when you stress procreation as the primary end of marriage, they will say, well, what about the elderly? What about people who are infertile? Does that mean that their marriages are not valid because they cannot conceive children? And the answer is no, of course not. Because in these situations, people are infertile just by incidents of health, age, or whatever, not because they are seeking ends contrary to the natural ends of marriage. They can still perform the conjugal act. The fact that age or health has rendered it infertile doesn't mean the act is not ordered to procreation. Just like the fact that a car is broke does not mean that it was not designed to drive. Now, with homosexual acts, we have something very different, not an incidental infertility in a naturally procreative act, but rather an intrinsic infertility due to the impossibility of the procreative act ever taking place. So biological sex is not irrelevant to marriage, and neither is the question of procreation. By nature, by God's design, evidence in our very biology, it is the primary end of matrimony.